The year was 2007, and the small town of San Giovanni lay hidden amidst the rolling hills of central Italy. The air was thick with the scent of olive trees, and the cobblestone streets echoed the footsteps of locals who lived in relative isolation. The town's tight-knit community was bound by centuries-old traditions, with the church at the center of it all. The parish was a sanctuary for its people, a place where faith was not just a belief, but a way of life. But beneath the peaceful exterior, a story was unfolding, one that would shake the very foundations of the community. Father Luca was the middle-aged priest who had served the town for nearly a decade. Charismatic, kind, and deeply devoted to his calling, he was beloved by the townspeople. Sister Maria, on the other hand, was a young nun, only in her early 30s, who had joined the convent after dedicating herself to the service of God. She was known for her warmth, a stark contrast to the typical coldness one might expect from a religious figure. Both were dedicated to their roles, Father Luca as the spiritual guide and Sister Maria as the caretaker, but their mutual respect for each other was growing, beyond mere professional admiration. At first, their relationship was entirely innocent. Father Luca and Sister Maria worked side by side in the parish, leading prayers, organizing charity events, and mentoring the youth. There was no indication that their connection would evolve into something more than just a strong professional camaraderie. They would often find themselves conversing late into the night, discussing everything from scripture to personal struggles. It was in these quiet moments that they began to realize they shared an uncommon emotional connection, but both were determined to maintain the boundaries of their vows. As the weeks passed, Father Luca and Sister Maria found their bond evolving from mere friendship into something deeper and more profound. Initially, they shared only professional conversations, discussing sermons, the well-being of the parish, and their shared devotion to faith. But these exchanges gradually became more intimate, as they began opening up about their personal struggles, their doubts, and their unspoken feelings of loneliness. Father Luca, often secluded in his priestly role, found in Sister Maria a confidant who understood his isolation. Sister Maria, too, who had dedicated herself to the church from a young age, had never known a friendship so pure and deep. The emotional intimacy they developed felt innocent at first, just two souls supporting each other. But as they shared more of themselves, they began to sense a shift in their connection. The long hours spent in quiet conversation were charged with an unspoken energy. A glance from Father Luca lingered a little too long, and Sister Maria began to catch herself blushing at the sound of his voice. Both tried to ignore it, burying the growing tension beneath layers of professional duty and religious devotion. However, it became impossible to ignore as their mutual respect deepened into longing. The turning point came one evening when they found themselves alone after a prayer service. They had been discussing a passage from the Bible about sacrifice, but the conversation drifted into more personal territory, with each of them expressing the deep loneliness they had felt in their religious vows. They found themselves in the quiet of the church, staring at each other in the dim light. The air between them was thick with emotion, and for the first time, neither of them could deny the desire they felt. In that moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. Their gaze held a mixture of longing and sadness, as if they both knew what was at stake, but could not resist the pull they felt. What had started as a simple emotional connection blossomed into a full-fledged attraction, one that neither had anticipated. But the consequences of acting on this newfound desire were clear. Father Luca had taken a vow of chastity, and Sister Maria had dedicated herself to a life of service to God. They were bound by their faith, and any romantic involvement would be a severe betrayal of that. Yet, neither could deny the overpowering feelings that had taken root in their hearts. One night, as they stood in the church after hours, the weight of their emotions became too much to bear. Their forbidden love had built up over time, and they gave in to it. It began with a hesitant touch, one that neither of them could have predicted. Then, slowly, they embraced, and the kiss that followed was tender, yet filled with an undeniable hunger. It was a release of pent-up emotions and a defiance of the vows they had taken. The act of passion that followed was brief but intense, a chaotic mix of guilt, desire, and ecstasy. In the silence of the church, surrounded by the sacred icons of their faith, they allowed themselves to experience something far removed from the purity they had been taught to embody. For a moment, they were just two people, vulnerable and human, caught in a whirlwind of longing. It was a forbidden moment, but it felt as if everything had aligned, as if the connection they had been fighting was finally set free. But in the aftermath, they both knew they had crossed a line that could never be undone. The aftermath of their passionate encounter left both Father Luca and Sister Maria grappling with intense emotions. The moments of ecstasy they had shared were quickly overshadowed by overwhelming guilt. The sacred vows they had taken to serve God and remain celibate were now shattered by their actions. Father Luca, torn between his spiritual duties and the powerful forbidden bond he had formed with Sister Maria, found himself doubting his faith. He could no longer see the altar in the same way, the weight of his sin pressing on his conscience with every step. For Sister Maria, the emotional fallout was just as severe. Raised in the church and having given her life to God, she felt as though she had betrayed the very foundation of her existence. The intense pleasure she had felt during their forbidden act was quickly replaced with an agonizing awareness of the consequences. Her faith, which had once been an unwavering source of strength, now felt like a distant echo. The profound guilt they both carried manifested in sleepless nights, silent prayers, and a cold distance that started to grow between them. Yet, despite the guilt, neither could deny that the bond they had forged had awakened something in them, an undeniable connection that would not easily be erased. The news of Sister Maria's pregnancy came as an overwhelming shock to both of them. At first, she dismissed the signs, feeling unwell, missing a period, as mere stress from the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. But as the weeks passed and her symptoms intensified, she could no longer deny the reality of what had occurred. Fear gripped her heart. How could she, a nun, be carrying a child? The guilt she already felt was now compounded by the knowledge that she was carrying Father Luca's child. The discovery of her pregnancy shattered any hope they had of returning to their previous lives. The child growing inside her was undeniable proof of their sin, a living testament to their forbidden love. Sister Maria, whose life had been dedicated to purity and service, now felt trapped by the consequences of their actions. She knew that if the pregnancy became known, both she and Father Luca would be condemned, expelled from the church, and ostracized by the community. The shame of their love would haunt them forever. In private moments, Father Luca and Sister Maria discussed their options, knowing they had to keep this secret at all costs. With no other viable options, Father Luca and Sister Maria devised a desperate plan to hide the pregnancy. They both knew that the moment the truth came out, their lives would be destroyed. They decided to keep it a secret for as long as possible. Sister Maria began wearing loose clothing to disguise her growing belly, and Father Luca, while still carrying out his duties at the church, withdrew from the community and spent more time alone, avoiding any unnecessary attention. They decided that the only way to preserve their lives and dignity was for Sister Maria to secretly give birth and leave the child with an adoptive family far from the town. They made arrangements to ensure the baby would be raised in a loving home, where it could grow up without knowing its true parentage. This plan was their only hope, but even as they made preparations, both of them knew that it was a temporary solution. The truth could not stay hidden forever, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. As the months passed, Sister Maria's pregnancy became harder to conceal. Her body, once so disciplined in its strict vows of chastity, now betrayed her with every passing day. The swelling of her belly could no longer be hidden beneath layers of loose clothing. The more she tried to keep it a secret, the more the community began to whisper. The older women, particularly those who worked closely with the church, began to notice the subtle signs. The pressure mounted, and both Father Luca and Sister Maria grew more anxious. Father Luca, whose reputation had been built on his holiness and his devotion to God, now found himself questioning everything. The scrutiny of the parishioners was becoming unbearable, and the fear of discovery seemed imminent. Every day they lived under the shadow of their secret, knowing that one wrong word, one careless glance, could expose everything. The burden of the lie weighed heavily on them both, and every interaction with others felt more like a performance. The dramatic culmination of Father Luca and Sister Maria's secret affair arrives when an elder from the church confronts Father Luca with undeniable suspicion. The elder, a longtime member of the parish, had noticed Sister Maria's increasing physical changes, the subtle signs of her pregnancy that couldn't go unnoticed. He had heard whispers around the town, rumors of what had happened between the priest and the nun, and now he came with accusations, demanding answers. This confrontation shatters the fragile life Father Luca had tried to hold together. He cannot deny what happened. The guilt is too overwhelming. He confesses to the elder that it was he who was responsible for the sin. But the elder's reaction isn't one of compassion, it is one of righteous fury. The elder chastises Father Luca for his betrayal of the vows, of the church, and of Sister Maria's sacred duty. He accuses him of leading her astray, condemning both of them for their transgression. This moment marks a rupture in the life of Father Luca. Everything he has worked for, his position in the church, his spiritual calling, his sense of identity, falls apart in a few explosive moments. Sister Maria, hearing the confrontation from a distance, rushes in, but it is too late. The damage has already been done. The guilt and shame overwhelm her, and she collapses emotionally, knowing the consequences of their actions are now unavoidable. In the wake of the tragic confrontation, Father Luca and Sister Maria retreat into the shadows. Their love, which had once flourished in secrecy, now casts them into complete isolation. The parishioners, upon hearing of the scandal, abandon them. Sister Maria's physical condition worsens due to the strain, and she falls ill, overcome with guilt and shame. Father Luca, too, is consumed by the burden of his actions. Once a man of honor and faith, he is now seen as a pariah, a man whose love for a fellow devotee has ruined both their lives. In a final attempt to shield her from the repercussions of their affair, Father Luca arranges for the child to be placed with a local family. The town that once revered him now looks at him with disdain. He has lost everything: the church, his calling, his community, and most tragically, his love for Sister Maria, who is drifting farther from him with each passing day. Their relationship, once filled with warmth and secret passion, is now nothing more than a haunting memory, leaving Father Luca to live in a personal purgatory. The child, born from their forbidden love, becomes the final testament to their passionate affair, but also the product of their greatest sin. Father Luca, too heartbroken to raise her, places the infant with a local family that can offer her a better, safer life away from the town. While Father Luca watches from afar, he is unable to be a part of her life, knowing that revealing his identity could lead to scandal and further shame. The adoptive family raises the child as their own, though they are unaware of her true parentage. She grows up in an environment filled with love, but there's always something about her, a sense of a hidden past, that lingers. She feels an inexplicable yearning for something more, for answers that nobody can provide. Father Luca watches over her from a distance, always unsure if he should reveal the truth. Her fate, seemingly unrelated to her parents' tragic love, becomes a quiet thread in their intertwined lives, a life shaped by the circumstances of her birth, though she would never fully understand them. Eventually, Father Luca is caught and arrested for his actions. His betrayal of the church and his vows results in his excommunication and imprisonment. The once eloquent priest who had inspired his congregation with his words and wisdom is now relegated to a cold, dark cell, stripped of his title, his faith, and his dignity. He is a man broken by the choices he made. In prison, Father Luca is forced to confront the consequences of his actions in isolation. The other prisoners do not understand his past, nor does he care to explain it. He spends his days in silence, reflecting on the events that led him to this point. He questions his faith, his role in the church, and whether he can ever find redemption. As his physical health deteriorates, so too does his spirit. His cell is the embodiment of his internal torment, and the remorse he feels for the harm caused to Sister Maria and the child grows heavier with each passing day. Father Luca's trial is a stark and quiet affair, held behind closed doors, away from the public eye. The trial is brief and unemotional, with little fanfare or defense. The court, comprised mostly of church officials, does not seek to understand the nuances of his sin, nor does it inquire deeply into the motivations that led to his actions. The evidence against him is damning: his affair with Sister Maria, their child, and his breach of sacred vows. It is all laid out plainly, and Father Luca does not contest the charges. He accepts them with the weight of guilt upon his shoulders. There is no dramatic speech in his defense, no pleading for mercy. Father Luca's faith has already begun to crumble. The church, which had once been his sanctuary, has turned against him. The trial is little more than a formal declaration of his guilt, a public acknowledgement that he is a disgrace in the eyes of both God and the law. The silence of the trial reflects the coldness of the church's judgment. There are no calls for compassion, only for punishment. The sentence is swift and harsh: life imprisonment. This final condemnation from the very institution he once revered feels like a death sentence. His identity, once tied to the priesthood, is now shattered. Father Luca is reduced to a nameless prisoner, a pariah both in the eyes of the church and the world. The years Father Luca spends in prison are a slow and torturous decline. His once strong physique deteriorates under the harsh conditions of confinement. His health, both physical and mental, begins to deteriorate. The cold, damp walls of his cell become a constant reminder of his betrayal and punishment. He spends long hours in silence, reflecting on the choices that led him to this place, feeling the crushing weight of guilt and regret. While other prisoners speak of their crimes with a certain pride or indifference, Father Luca's crime is one of a deeply personal nature. He does not relate to the others. Instead, he isolates himself in a self-imposed emotional exile. There is no sense of redemption in his heart. His days are filled with prayers that seem unanswered and reflections that seem to lead nowhere. The same regret loops in his mind: how he lost Sister Maria, how he could not protect their love, and how he could never raise the child they created together. The loneliness of the prison becomes his penance, a constant reminder that he has forfeited everything he once held dear. Father Luca finds little solace, even in his faith. He no longer feels the divine connection he once had. Instead, he is consumed by the distance between his former self and the broken man he has become. As Father Luca's physical health declines further, he becomes weaker, frail from the years of neglect and the toll of prison life. It is clear that he does not have much longer to live. In his final days, the remorse he has felt throughout his imprisonment culminates in a last, desperate attempt at redemption. He writes a letter. The letter is addressed to the child he never knew, a child he cannot speak to directly. In it, he confesses his deepest regrets, offering a heartfelt apology for the life he has led. He writes of his love for her mother, Sister Maria, and how their love, though born of sin, was real and pure in its own way. He explains that he never intended for their affair to result in such tragedy, and that he has spent every day since regretting the consequences of his actions. The letter is also an expression of sorrow for the life the child had to live without him. Father Luca is aware that his mistakes have cast a long shadow over her, and he hopes that one day when she is older, she will understand the complexity of the love that created her. The letter ends with a simple plea for forgiveness, though Father Luca knows it may never be granted. It is his final attempt to atone for his sins, and a last expression of his love, one that he hopes will transcend the barriers of time and circumstance. Though the child grows up unaware of the truth about her parents, she carries within her the legacy of their love, a love that is complicated and hidden in the shadows of their past. As she grows older, she begins to sense that there is something different about her origins. There are subtle clues in the way she is treated by the people around her and the stories she hears about her birth. But the truth remains elusive. The child's legacy is one of silence and secrecy. She knows she was adopted, but she has never felt completely at ease with the idea of her true identity being hidden. As she matures, she starts to ask questions about her birth and her biological parents. Yet the answers are never clear, and the people around her are reluctant to speak of the past. This silence only fuels her desire for understanding. When Father Luca's letter is finally discovered, after his death, it is as if a missing piece of her life falls into place. The letter reveals the deep love her biological parents shared and the sacrifices they made. It also shows the immense burden of guilt Father Luca carried, and how he viewed her as both the product of their love and a symbol of his greatest failure. His final words bring her a sense of closure, and the legacy of her parents' love becomes a bittersweet, complex part of who she is. She is not just the child of a scandal. She is the child of two souls who loved each other deeply, even in the face of insurmountable odds. Upon reading the letter, the daughter embarks on a journey to understand the full extent of her parents' story. She visits the town where she was born and begins to piece together the fragmented narrative of Father Luca and Sister Maria. She speaks with old parishioners who remember the priest, the nun, and the scandal that rocked their small community. As she uncovers the truth, she experiences a mixture of emotions: anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of loss. She learns about the sacrifices Father Luca made to protect her, and the loneliness that plagued Sister Maria. The daughter's journey becomes a process of reconciliation, not just with her parents, but with the complexity of her own identity. Along the way, she discovers that the love between Father Luca and Sister Maria was not just an act of passion, but a deeply human one. It was the kind of love that transcends the rules of the Church, but also the kind that ultimately brought great suffering. The daughter, now fully aware of the tragedy that shaped her life, decides to find peace with the past and let go of the anger that has followed her for so long. The daughter's return to the town where her parents' love story began is both a journey of closure and a return to the roots of her own existence. She stands at the site of the old church, now abandoned and weathered, where her parents first met and fell in love. It is here that their love bloomed and ultimately withered, and here she must come to terms with the weight of their choices. She visits the graves of Father Luca and Sister Maria, paying her respects. Standing over their graves, she feels a deep sense of connection to them both, despite the years of separation and silence. She understands now that their love, while tragic, was real, and that it was part of her own legacy. The town, once a place of pain and betrayal for her, now holds a sense of peace. It is the final resting place of the story she had spent so long trying to understand. By returning to the town, the daughter comes to realize that she has the power to choose what kind of legacy she will leave behind. Her parents' story will always be a part of her, but it doesn't have to define her future. In her final act of closure, the daughter stands on the hill overlooking the town, reflecting on the love story that shaped her life. She takes in the view, the very landscape where her parents' lives intersected, and where the consequences of their love left deep scars. She understands that forgiveness does not come easily, but it is essential for moving forward. As she lets go of the anger and grief that had followed her for so long, she finally feels a sense of peace. Her parents' love was flawed, but it was genuine, and it led to her existence, her own journey, her own future. With a deep breath, she says a quiet, final farewell to the past. The story of Father Luca and Sister Maria no longer holds her captive. It has shaped her, but it will not define her. As she walks away from the town, she carries with her their legacy, a story of love, loss, and ultimately, redemption.